Welcome back to Cinematic Music Production Tips. It's good to be back after a little bit of a hiatus. I've been working on a couple of film projects and I didn't manage to produce any new videos for my YouTube channel for quite a while. But today I want to talk about layering samples. This is a fairly common and useful technique that, when used sensibly, can help take the quality of your MIDI production to the next level. You can layer two or more articulations from the same library, or you could layer different libraries. Let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say we have a short line for violas. I'm using Cinematic Studio Strings here, one of my go-tos for when I need strings. Whether you're working with instrument tracks or MIDI tracks, layering will work with either. You could either duplicate your tracks, or you could have your instruments split between multiple tracks, most commonly one articulation per track. This is actually a relatively popular approach to working with samples. So one track would be your legato or longs, next would be your staccato, then spiccato, and so on. It's extremely easy to layer them by simply copying your MIDI regions over to a second track. However, my workflow is much less common, because as I've mentioned before, I like to print MIDI to audio as soon as possible, so I'm going to go ahead and do that first. I've got some macros and empty hidden tracks set up to print the entire CSS library with just 2 button presses. First I'll unhide CSS audio print tracks, and next I will print the library. Notice that I've got each mic position separately for each instrument here. I also sometimes group main and room mics and print several instruments to one audio file, but for a few specific libraries I like to keep them completely separate. Let's now print them to audio. And I also make use of another macro that deletes all silent audio regions after the printing is done. Now that the silent regions have been deleted, I can hide empty tracks again. Okay, so that was a short detour from the actual topic of this video, layering. So listening to this viola line now, I'm thinking that it could really use a bit of bite and emphasis just when it reaches that top F note on the downbeat of the second bar. If you're working with instrument tracks, this is where you would either duplicate your instrument. If you're working one articulation per track, this is where you would copy your MIDI data over. In my template, I've only got one MIDI track with all the articulations in the same track, and I'm using expression maps. What I do is I've got some macros set up that let me duplicate and rename the MIDI tracks in case I want to add extra layers. So I'm just triggering the macro now, and a new MIDI track gets added and renamed to CSS-L2 for layer 2. Next I'm going to delete all the other notes and just leave the top F in this layer and then quantize it. The legato notes need to trigger before the beat in order to be in time, but the short articulations can be quantized to the grid if you're using a negative track delay like I am, which in this case is minus 60 milliseconds. And finally, I'm going to switch the articulation for this note to marcato, and maybe tweak its velocity a little bit. Let's listen. That's more the kind of effect I was after. Going to print this one to audio too, and then move on. Here's another quick macro that I'm using to duplicate the audio tracks, delete the regions on those tracks, and then rename the tracks. Just takes a second and then we're ready to print the second layer. Another really useful technique is layering different libraries. You can get very creative with this, and there are a lot of interesting possibilities. For example, a common way to add more detail would be to layer solo strings on top of section strings. Or if you want to go in the other direction, then adding a larger or more ambient library could be the right answer. Let's try adding Performance Samples con moto violas to this line. I'll unhide the con moto MIDI tracks and copy over the MIDI region. Then quantize it. Here too I'm using a negative track delay of minus 140 milliseconds, so it can be locked to the grid. Let's listen to these violas soloed. There's a fair bit more ambience or room to the sound. Let's hear CSS alone again. And now let's layer them together and hear the results. that's a nice sound. I like the way the very smooth legato transitions from CSS combine with the more defined transitions of Konmoto, and the ambience from Konmoto helps the section sound bigger. And that's pretty much it when it comes to layering samples. I use layering all the time with string samples. Some of my favorite combinations include Cinematic Studio strings layered with Cinematic Studio solo strings, but also with Spitfire chamber strings, with Berlin strings, and with strays of sampling afflatus. I also often use layering with brass samples as well, where short notes can really add punch to the beginnings of longer notes. That's it for this time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.